Good morning. This is our fourth video on ecology, and today, inshallah, we are going to discuss the food webs. Of course, you know what food chains are, and food webs are nothing but interwoven or interconnected food chains because you cannot separate food chains from each other since there are always interactions between the different trophic levels of the different food chains. And in every food chain, a particular organism can be in the first, second, third, or fourth trophic levels. For example, in this relationship, we have producers represent the first trophic level, and man represents the second trophic level. And here, man is considered, when I say man, of course, I mean human beings in general. Here, man represents the first consumer. But sometimes producers like green plants are being ingested or consumed by herbivores, in which case the herbivores would be considered the first consumers. And then herbivores can, like rabbits, for example, can be eaten by man, in which case man is considered a second consumer and would be in the third trophic level. You know, of course, that we have different types of food chains. We have terrestrial food chains and we have marine food chains. An example of a terrestrial food chain where all the organisms live on land is a green plant, for example, being considered the first trophic level, or being considered the producer, can be eaten by a grasshopper, and then the grasshopper can be consumed by a frog, and then the frog by a hawk. So the grasshopper here is considered the first consumer, and the grasshopper, of course, here is a herbivore, and then the frog, that is a carnivore, would be considered the second consumer, but although it is the second consumer, yet it is present here in that food chain in the third trophic level. Another example, of course, you have noticed that the terrestrial food chain starts by a producer, which is a green plant. And then we have the marine food chain. And as I said in the previous video, food chains always have to start by producers, whether these producers are multi-celled organisms or are one-celled organisms. So here we have the producer that is capable of synthesizing organic food from inorganic material is the phytoplankton. So the phytoplankton is the autotroph at the beginning of the, and we say autotroph because autotroph is a more general word for organisms that can make their own organic material from inorganic substances. And autotrophs are usually or mostly phototrophs, where the source of the energy is light energy, whereas a few of them are chemotrophs, where the source of energy is chemical energy. And then autotrophs will be consumed by zooplanktons, and zooplanktons again are microscopic organisms that feed on phytoplanktons. They are thus considered the first consumers, and so on. So these are examples of terrestrial and aquatic or marine food chains. Here you have a picture of the phytoplanktons or the diatoms. As you see, they are microscopic organisms that are marine and that live in seawater or oceans, and they are autotrophs. And zooplanktons feed on diatoms, and diatoms is the other name for phytoplanktons. And here you can see a food web, and of course you can have a look and see how the different food chains interweave with each other or are interwoven. And you can select, for example, phytoplankton being eaten by a trout, and then a trout being eaten by a bald eagle, or phytoplankton eaten by a trout and then by a human being, and so on. So there is intercommunication between the food chains. And here we have a very easy comparison between the producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. Of course, all the producers are autotrophs. All the primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers are heterotrophs. Now, the producers are usually green plants. They are usually green plants. And but not always, of course, as we said, because there are other organisms that can be considered autotrophics, like the diatoms, for example, and there are other organisms that are chemotrophs. So like some bacteria, for example. So it's not only about green plants, but we have chemotrophic bacteria that utilize chemical energy. But if we are talking about green plants, then the first consumer will be considered a herbivore, like rabbits, for example. And an organism that feeds on a herbivore is a carnivore, and an organism that feeds on a carnivore is a carnivore. So secondary consumers and tertiary consumers are usually carnivores. A secondary consumer cannot be a herbivore. The producers convert light energy into chemical bond energy. Of course, again, since we are talking about light energy, then we are talking about phototrophic organisms like green plants and diatoms, phototrophic. But if they are using chemical energy, they would be called chemotrophs. And the primary consumers the primary consumers, of course, will eat the producers, and then the secondary consumers will eat the primary consumers, and the secondary consumers will eat the primary consumers. Now, as we said before, each trophic level, the energy that is transferred from each trophic level to the subsequent trophic level is only 10% of the previous trophic level. So if you consider that the energy, if you're talking energy, you're talking pyramids of energy, then if you consider that the energy at the bottom of the pyramid is 100% energy, if you talk biomass, then you would consider the first trophic level having 100% of the biomass that you can determine in grams or in kilograms according to which biomass you're talking about. Similarly, the unit of energy, as we said before, can be a joule or kilojoule or kilocalorie according to the amount or the level of energy you're talking about. Under any of these conditions, the second trophic level would receive only 10%, or would store actually only 10% of the basic amount of energy that was in the producer. The third trophic level will receive 1/10 of the 10%, and therefore 1%. And the last trophic level, which is usually the level of the tertiary consumers, or the fourth trophic level, will have the least biomass. If you're talking biomass, it will have the least energy if you're talking energy, and it is usually the top of the food chain, because, as we said, the decomposers are not being represented in the pyramids, and the energy that is stored in the tertiary consumer is only 0.1%, and that's the main reason why food chains cannot have more than, usually cannot have more than 4 trophic levels. If we are determining diatoms and phytoplanktons to be the producers, then the primary consumers in such a case would be the zooplanktons, and the secondary consumers would be frogs in water or small fish, and the tertiary consumers would be hawks that feed on frogs. So it is the one at the apex of the pyramid, or at the top of the pyramid, is the least stable trophic level, and we will see why. Because first of all, why is it, or what does it mean that it is the least stable trophic level? It means that any change that occurs in the lower trophic levels will be magnified in the uppermost trophic level. Meaning that if you have, for example, a drop in energy by 50% here, then it will be intensified because you receive only 10% of the 50%, then you receive only 5% of the amount. So it is the least stable trophic level because any change that occurs will be magnified. If you add a toxic substance here, we will see that this toxic substance will be concentrated. If there is drought and there is a diminution in the quantity or in the biomass of the previous trophic levels, you will find that this top trophic level will be the most affected, and the animals or the organisms at the top of the pyramid might perish because of lack of nutrition. This is what we call biological magnification. What do we mean by biological magnification? We mean that organisms at the higher most trophic levels are the most affected by any change. First of all, they are the most affected by any change that occurs in the previous trophic levels. And of course, the most famous example of biological magnification is the example of concentration of the accumulated toxins that are stored in their bodies. For example, this bird is called the bald eagle, and the bald eagle has almost become extinct because people in America used to spray the plants and the forests heavily with the DDT pesticide. It's a kind of pesticide that was revolutionary at the epoch in the 1950s because scientists during that period thought that the DDT pesticide is capable of killing all pests that affect all pests that affect, that we have pesticides and herbicides. Pests affect the plants, but herbicides, so when you give a pesticide, the pesticide kills the pests that might cause disease to the plants. But when you give herbicides, then you are killing the herbicide, then you're killing the herbs that grow in between the trees and that compete with the trees for the available nutrition in the soil. So you need to spray with pesticides to kill the pests that cause diseases to the plants, and you need to spray herbicides to kill the surplus of herbs that are damaging to the forests. What happened actually that they heavily sprayed the plants with pesticides, and these pesticides were absorbed by the plants and they entered therefore the food chain, and their concentration was gradually increased or augmented for every trophic level until their concentration reached the maximum at the top of the food chain. Why is this possible? Because as you know, if I have 1,000 kilograms, for example, of plants, of green plants or herbs, this will be eaten by 100 kilograms only biomass of rabbits, and the 100 kilograms of rabbits will be eaten by only 10 kilograms biomass of lions, for example, and this will be eaten by only 1 kilogram of the bald eagle. Of course, the eagle is not only 1 kilogram in mass, it might be, for example, 50 kilograms in mass. So in such a case, see how many kilograms of plants have been consumed until one eagle with a 50 kilogram mass, if you multiply this value by 50, you would find 50,000 kilograms. So it looks incredible, but this is what happens truly because of this 90% diminution in the biomass every time we go upward in the food chain. And this is the reason of the biological magnification. The biological magnification, or the concentration, whose best example is, or whose very striking example is the accumulation of toxins, results because one big eagle, for example, needs a huge mass of herbs and plants to survive. The bald eagle, for example, does not eat these herbs directly, but gradually through the food chain. What's wrong about DDT? DDT interferes with the deposition of calcium, and therefore it will interfere with the deposition of calcium salts in the eggshell of the bald eagle. And therefore the eggs of the bald eagle, because it's a bird, then it lays eggs, were very thin walled and would not support or support the survival of the young embryos inside, and that's why the young embryos used to die. But nowadays, DDT is outlawed, DDT is banned, and the bald eagle was saved from extinction because of human intervention. So human intervention at the beginning resulted in an almost extinction of the bald eagle, and then human intervention afterward, when human beings discovered the huge mistake they made, human intervention helped again in saving the bald eagle. Sorry. So this is a slide that shows biological magnification. These are parts, ppm stands for parts per million, okay? So here the concentration of the DDT in the green plant was only 0.04 parts per million, and then in the second trophic level it was almost, not exactly, of course, 10%, but it has been magnified like 5%. And then here it has been magnified 10%, and then here it has been magnified 6%. So if you multiply here by 5, and then you multiply by almost 10, and then you multiply by 6, see how many times it has been magnified. Now, the decomposers are, of course, as you know, they are living organisms that cause decay of the other living organisms after they die or they pass away. And the decomposers are usually either decomposer bacteria in the soil or fungi. The decomposers are not depicted in any diagram of a food chain because it goes without saying that they should be present. They are very important because they recycle the organic material that is present in the bodies of dead animals, and they reconvert that organic material into inorganic material. So organic into inorganic. So the organic material, like, for example, carbohydrates, like proteins, like fats in the bodies of dead animals, will be again recycled and decomposed and broken down. Actually, decomposition is a process of breaking down. So they will be broken down again into inorganic components like water and carbon dioxide and inorganic salts. And this is very important to nourish the plants that derive their nutrition from the soil. Of course, decomposers are very important because of many reasons. The most important reason is that they recycle the organic material, and the second important reason is that they prevent the accumulation of biomass on Earth. Recycling is important. Recycling is important. We will say why. At the same time, they prevent the accumulation of biomass, the accumulation of biomass. And of course, this is important because since living organisms were created, there was no recycling, living organisms would no more find a place to live in on Earth. So furthermore, there wouldn't be recycling. What's the importance of recycling here? What's the importance of converting organic into inorganic material? We are returning the inorganic material to nourish the plants, and therefore we are ensuring continuity of life on Earth. So recycling is important for continuity. Continuity of what? Of something very important. It is continuity of life forms or continuity of life on Earth. This concept on the slide you see, which is ecological succession, is very important, and it comes frequently on the tests. Ecological succession is simply the sequential rebuilding of an ecosystem. This means what? This means that when we say rebuilding, this means that a particular ecosystem has disappeared or has been destroyed for a reason or another. And then we are trying to rebuild rebuild the ecosystem. Of course, this occurs spontaneously, even without the interference of human beings. So this is number one. It is not building of an ecosystem, but it is rebuilding of an already destroyed ecosystem. And it is sequential, meaning that it occurs in steps. As we said before, most populations are dynamic, meaning that we all the time have birth and we have death. So even if you reach a certain more or less stable carrying capacity, K, then this doesn't mean that there are no fluctuations. This is number one. The carrying capacity is a more or less stable value, but there are fluctuations, ups and downs around the carrying capacity. Furthermore, even if it were a straight line, this doesn't mean that it is stagnant. No, all the time there are new birth and new death, and the rate of the birth, the birth is additive, whereas the death is subtractive. As we said, the size of the population will fluctuate around the carrying capacity, and we might have migration of new species into a particular habitat, or certain other species can leave the habitat. Whether there is migration, an addition of new individuals and maybe new species to a certain ecosystem, or there was emigration and they left it, this would disturb the dynamic equilibrium for a while. So this carrying capacity is a state of dynamic equilibrium, but it is a state of dynamic equilibrium with ups and downs or with fluctuations around the mean value. So first of all, this is one of the factors that might disturb the ecosystem. The second factor that might disturb the ecosystem are the major disturbances that occur in an ecosystem, whether these major disturbances are natural, like, for example, volcanic eruptions, like mining, like clear cutting of a forest, like fires, or it might be human-made. Human-made like what? Sorry, human-made like clear cutting of a forest. So, of course, volcanic eruptions are natural, forest fires are natural, but mining and cutting trees in the forests are man-induced. If this destruction is a massive destruction that removes most of the organisms in a particular ecosystem, then gradually, and even without human interference, there would be sequential rebuilding of that ecosystem, and this is what we call ecological succession. When when we rebuild an ecosystem that does not even possess a soil, where everything has been destroyed, even the soil, and we are trying to rebuild it, or it is trying to rebuild itself on its own, then it is called primary ecological succession. So primary ecological succession applies when there is no soil. Okay, so the main challenge in primary ecological succession is to rebuild the soil, because if you don't have the soil, you wouldn't have autotrophs, you wouldn't have green plants, for example, and you wouldn't have the essential producers for that ecosystem. So after any ecosystem is destroyed, and we're talking now about destruction plus soil destruction, so even the soil has been destroyed. So here we need a very important group of organisms to firstly inhabit this barren area, and we call them the pioneer organisms, meaning that these should be organisms that can survive in an area that has been devoid of any factors of any living organisms, even not the non-living things like the soil. So what kind of pioneer organisms are important to start the primary ecological succession? We have two famous organisms. We have the lichens, and we have the mosses. So what are the lichens? The lichens are symbionts, meaning that they represent a relationship between two organisms that are algae and fungi. Is this symbiosis important? Yes, this symbiosis is important because the algae are autotrophic organisms, meaning that these autotrophic organisms, these organisms are capable of converting inorganic material like carbon dioxide and water into organic material, whereas the fungi are heterotrophic organisms, meaning that they cannot build their own food, but the fungi can absorb the food that is made by the algae. So the algae are autotrophs. They make food, they make organic food from inorganic material, and the fungi are heterotrophs. They just have root-like material, which is called the root-like structures that can absorb the organic material. Other than this symbiotic relationship of the lichens, we have the mosses. And the mosses are a type of primitive plants that are avascular plants, meaning that they don't have xylem or phloem, they don't have vessels inside them, but still they are flowering. So they look like short grasses or short herbs, and they reproduce asexually by spores. So when they reproduce asexually by spores, this simply means that if there is some air currents like wind, then those spores will be transferred to the areas where we need ecological succession to be done accidentally, of course, and they will grow into new herbs. But the problem here is that we don't have soil. We have just talked about algae and fungi. We have just talked about algae and fungi, okay? So algae, what do? They take carbon dioxide. They are autotrophic algae, but algae usually live in moist areas. So algae require carbon dioxide and require water to photosynthesize. Fungi cannot synthesize their own organic material, and they will absorb it to save time from the algae. But the fungi will have an important task, which is to absorb, for example, water for the algae to for actually the algae to photosynthesize. But the problem here, whether we are talking about this symbiotic relationship or about the spores and the mosses that will grow, that they need soil to grow on, and we already don't have soil. So how would we solve the problem of a soil? Soil develops gradually as the rocks weather. So actually, for example, suppose there is fire that has destroyed the soil in that area, but as wind and rain have like friction with the upper surface of the rocks, there would be particles of the superficial layers of the rocks that would separate from the rock and settle down here to form soil, new soil. So actually, weathering of the rocks, weathering, you know, of course, what weathering is. Weathering of the rocks is one major source of forming soil in the process of primary ecological succession, where we even don't have soil to start with. So this is number one. So one of the important sources is weathering of the rocks. The second important source of formation of soil or rebuilding of soil is the organic material that accumulates from decomposition of the algae and the fungi. Once soil is present, of course, other bigger organisms like grasses, like bushes and trees can develop later on. Okay, so we have algae and fungi that are pioneer organisms. This lichen, this symbiotic relationship, again, can be carried, by the way, there are microscopic algae, there are or unicellular algae, there are also unicellular or one-celled fungi, and these organisms can be carried to the place, and together with the weathering of the rocks and together with the accumulation of organic material from decomposition, we can have a new soil. And when the spores of the mosses fall on this soil, they can flourish and form those small grasses that are called the mosses. And afterward, gradually, the soil would become more and more fertile and rich by decomposition of further organic matter. At that time, when the soil becomes more rich, we can have bigger trees and bigger plants. And then we're going to talk about what we call climax communities. At the end, so we started with what? We started with lichens, and we started with a very small amount of mosses spores that are carried by wind, and a very small amount of soil, minimum soil, that results from rock weathering. And then gradually we would have more and more soil, more and more soil, until we get enough fertile soil to have larger trees and larger plants. Okay, so at the end, there is a final stable community that will be capable of surviving in that place where primary ecological succession has occurred, and we call it the climax community. This climax community will remain until the ecosystem is once again destroyed by another disaster, another blowout, a disaster that destroys the community once again. Okay, so we have gradual rebuilding of the ecosystem until we get a final stable community that we call the climax community. And that climax community might persist for years and years until a new disaster comes and erodes the whole place, the whole organisms, and we start rebuilding again. Every time, the climax community that stabilizes at the end is the one that is most adapted to the environment. So when we reach the climax community, we reach the community that is nearly perfectly adapted to the environment. A very good example of this are the old growth forests, those forests that have been lasting for thousands of years. Why have they been lasting for thousands of years as long as there are no disasters? This is because they were the most perfectly adapted to that environment. So here we can have a diagram where we discuss the primary ecological succession. So, for example, here you have the exposed rocks or the weathered rocks, the exposed rocks or the weathered rocks. And on the weathered rocks, we have lichens and mosses spores, lichens plus mosses. And then gradually we see higher plants like grasses, herbs, shrubs. And then afterward, we get the trees. Of course, how did we get the trees? We didn't get the trees from nowhere. There were tree seedlings that came carried by wind. So they are wind-borne with an E at the end. But now, at the beginning, like before, at the beginning of the primary ecological succession, if those seedlings had come, they wouldn't have been accepted by the soil. They wouldn't have been supported by the soil because the soil wasn't yet that rich at the moment. But now that we reached that level of richness and thickness of the soil, so we need a certain thickness for the soil, and we need a certain fertility or richness for the soil, a certain amount of nutrients. At that time, we can get the high trees like the pine trees, the black spruce, the jack pine, the white spruce, and all these examples of forest trees. Of course, one of the major and famous types of primary ecological succession is the southern edge of Lake Michigan. So gradually, the lake shore receded northward, receded, sorry. So actually, what receded was the seawater, and when the water receded northward towards the north after the last ice age, like 10,000 years ago, there was exposure of new sand beaches and new sand dunes that were exposed. And today, if someone who begins at the water edge and walks south like this for several miles, you will pass through a series of communities of plants and living organisms that have been formed over the last 10,000 years, because all these areas at the beginning were marine or were occupied by marine organisms because they were covered by water, or actually by aquatic organisms because they were covered by the water of the Lake of Michigan. But when the water receded towards the north, there was the bottom that is actually sandy, that has been exposed. Here, sand is not a good soil for growth of the plants. So there should be primary ecological succession. That's why we consider the new communities that have been formed in that area, we consider it primary ecological succession, although we have sand, because we had to convert this sand first into rich soil, like clay soil, for example. And this came through weathering of rocks, if any. at the bottom of the lake, and then all the steps that we mentioned. So these communities will represent the various stages. So we began by a bare, meaning that we didn't have any organism on top, a bare sandy beach, until we ended up by having this. You see the difference between the two. Now we have forests, and those forests that are present instead of the sand are the climax community. Okay? And the climax community will differ in different areas of this previously sandy shore, because in other areas we might find, for example, the maple trees. In other areas you can find oak and hickory trees. So actually every group of trees has appeared in the environment where they were best adapted, meaning that the seeds of all trees came wind-borne and spread all over the sandy beach, but only those that were adapted, that were best adapted to that particular area would grow. So the maple forest trees, or the maple trees, grew in areas where they were most adapted. The hickory and oak grew in other areas where they were most adapted. What about the seeds of other trees? The seeds of other trees simply did not germinate because they weren't placed in their most suitable environment. Then we have the secondary ecological succession. In secondary ecological succession, you have a certain community, and again, that certain community will be removed by a certain incident or disaster. But the main difference is that in this case, in secondary ecological succession, the soil is preserved. And this is what happened in 1988 in the Yellowstone National Park. There were repeated fires, and the repeated fires destroyed the old growth that were present before, and they were essentially dominated by pine trees. And as you know, that the pine trees are very high trees. But when these pine trees were removed by the fires, the soil was kept intact. So the trees were removed, but the soil was intact. So the trees were removed, but the soil was intact. And this time, within 1 year, the burnt areas in the Yellowstone were covered with new vegetations. At the beginning, of course, the vegetations are short, as you see, but maybe hundreds of years afterward, we can find again those, or tens of years, I don't know, we might have longer pine trees, or the very long pine trees. And now we're going to talk about a biome. So a biome is a very large region of the earth that is characterized by a specific type of vegetation and animal life. So if I tell you that a biome, for example, if this is Earth, if I tell you that a biome is a large area of Earth or a large region of Earth, you would tell me, so what is the limit, or what are the criteria that allow us to divide the Earth into different biomes? It all depends on the type of vegetation, and therefore, of course, the type of animal life that lives in that biome. So you will see that every biome will be characterized by a specific type of vegetation and a specific type of animal life. So I would remove this and say a specific type of vegetations and animal life. And of course, the distribution of organisms, or even the type, essentially, first, when we say distribution, we mean distribution between the different biomes, but within each biome, the specific types of vegetations, and therefore the specific types of animals that will live there, will depend upon two main factors. The first factor is rainfall, and the second factor is temperature. We have, of course, major categories of biomes. So we have freshwater biomes, we have marine biomes, and we can group freshwater biomes and marine biomes into aquatic biomes, and then we have the terrestrial biomes, meaning those that live on land. Now, for the terrestrial biomes, there is a trend in those terrestrial biomes in the northern hemisphere from the equator to the most northerly climes. So, for example, if we consider, let's erase first. So, for example, if this is the equator, okay, this is the equator of the Earth, then if we are considering the north half of the Earth, then we will start by the tropical rainforest. So over the different continents here between here and there, we will have tropical rainforest. And then, for example, we would have the desert, and then we would have the grassland, and then we would have the temperate deciduous forest, TD, and then we will have the taiga, and then finally the tundra in the north. So you have the tropical rainforests, tropical, TR, and then you have desert, and then you have grassland, and then you have again forest, but temperate deciduous forest, and then the taiga, and then the tundra. Of course, as we go upwards, we are changing, as we go upwards, we are changing the latitude, okay? See those horizontal lines that divide the Earth horizontally, but those changes in the latitude will have similar changes as those in the altitude, meaning that if in a particular place, say for example in Egypt, you have a very high mountain, okay? So you have different altitudes, you have different heights. So if you have, for example, like a group of organisms in one level, then you can have, for example, if you have tropical forests at the bottom, not in Egypt, if we start by tropical forest and then upwards, you would have tundra, meaning that changes in the altitude are similar or make similar changes as the changes in altitude. For example, let's give the example that is present on the slides. On the slopes, for example, of the Appalachian Mountains, I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing it correctly or not, in the east, and the Rockies and coastal ranges in the west, there is a similar trend in the biome. So on this, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, the Appalachian Mountain, then you will have similar trends, meaning that you have first tropical forest, and then you have desert plants, and then you have grassland, and then you have temperate deciduous forests, and then you have the taiga again and the tundra at the north. So as you go upward in altitude, in height, then the temperature will decrease, the humidity and the concentration of water vapor decrease, and therefore that's why you can find deciduous forest, then taiga, then tundra. What can we conclude from this? We can conclude that tundra needs cool temperatures and dry weather. So at the northernmost areas of the Earth, we have a very cold atmosphere, and we have dry weather, and this helps the life of taiga and tundra. So the major world biomes, we have the marine biome. It is the largest, as we said before. It covers 3/4 of the Earth's surface. It is the most stable, and this is related to the properties of water, as we said before, the high specific heat capacity of water, and in addition to the large volumes of water bodies. So we have a huge volume of water that has a very high specific heat capacity, and therefore not only is the temperature over the marine biomes stable, but it also helps to moderate the temperature changes in the atmosphere around the marine or watery biomes in general. And as we said, it has the highest productivity, primary productivity, because of the large surface area. The marine biome itself is divided into like different subbiomes or different regions. This is depending upon the amount of sunlight they receive. Of course, you know that the superficial most layers of the waters most layers of the waters will receive the greatest amount of sunlight, and therefore the deepest layers will receive the smallest amount of sunlight. The distance from the shore, because as you go farther from the shore, this is related to the depth of water. And the marine biome will also depend upon which layer you're talking about. For example, if you have, for example, you consider a biome that is present in the part of the ocean that is away from the bottom of the ocean, we call this open water biome. But if you have here, we call at the bottom here, we call this the ocean bottom biome. So there are different factors that affect the characteristics of a particular marine biome. I'll pause here and then I'll be sending new, and I think it would be the 5th part of the video. Thank you, guys.